It is 4 in the morning in Washington, the 30th of March, 1867. A single lamp burns in the office of the Secretary of State. The city outside is asleep. Two men have been awake all night. One of them is American, the other is Russian. On the desk between them lies a treaty, and the treaty has just been finished. William Seward lifts his pen. He signs his name. With that signature, the United States agrees to buy a piece of land larger than Texas, California, and Montana combined. More than 500,000 square miles of it. The price is $7.2 million. It comes to about 2 cents an acre. By the time the sun rises, the newspapers will already be sharpening their knives. They will call it a folly, a frozen mistake, an icebox bought with the public's money. They are looking at the same map Seward is looking at, and on that map they see nothing but snow. He is buying it anyway. He believes that one day the country will understand what he understood in that quiet room before dawn. He will not live long enough to be proven right. This is the story of what those 2 cents actually bought, and of the people who were never asked. This is Alaska. In the spring of 1867, almost no one in America wanted it. The press called the purchase Seward's Folly. They called the territory Seward's Icebox. One newspaper joked that the country had bought itself a polar bear garden and that the Secretary of State had clearly lost his mind. The complaint was simple. Why pay millions for a wasteland of ice at the top of the world? A place with no roads, no cities anyone had heard of, nothing, as far as anyone could see, worth owning. The deal nearly did not survive its own unpopularity. The treaty passed the Senate, but the money to pay for it had to pass the House, and the House was in no mood to spend millions on snow. The Russian minister who had negotiated the sale, a careful man named Edward de Sturkel, spent months in Washington working the corridors, and a large sum of money quietly disappeared into the right hands before the funds were finally approved. The greatest land deal in American history almost died over a bribe. And then, for nearly 30 years, the joke held. The territory sat there, far away and ignored, costing more than it earned, proof to everyone that Seward had been a fool. And then, in 1896, someone found gold. The gold was only the beginning. Beneath that supposed wasteland lay one of the largest oil fields ever discovered on the continent. Above it stood the highest mountain in North America. Around it moved some of the richest fishing waters on Earth. The 2 cents an acre that America was mocked for spending would be repaid many times over. But there is a question the Folly story has never asked. When 2 empires sat down to trade this land, one of them selling, one of them buying, neither of them stopped to ask the people who already lived on it. Those people were not part of the deal. They had been here for thousands of years. They would pay for it anyway. Start with the simplest thing the mockers got wrong. They pictured an empty land. It was never empty. In the river valleys of the South, the brown bears of Alaska grow larger than brown bears anywhere else on the planet. On Kodiak Island, where the Russians first landed, a single bear can stand 10 feet tall and weigh well over 1,000 pounds. Through the long days of summer, it eats almost without stopping, packing on hundreds of pounds of fat because it must sleep through an entire winter on whatever it can store. When the snow comes, it digs a den into a hillside, and its heart slows to a handful of beats a minute. It waits out the dark months in a sleep that is not quite sleep, living on its own body until the light returns. The bears were here long before any flag. They are part of what the land always was. Under all that snow the newspapers saw, not a wasteland, but one of the last places left on Earth where the largest animals still have room to be large. To understand why Russia was willing to sell something this vast for so little, you have to go back to what brought the Russians here in the first place. It was not gold. It was not oil. It was not the mountains. It was the fur of a single animal. The sea otter is not a large creature. Curled at the surface of the cold Pacific, wrapped in a strand of kelp so the current will not carry it away while it sleeps, it looks almost gentle. But it wears the densest fur of any mammal alive. Close to 1 million hairs in a single square inch of skin. It has no blubber to keep it warm in these waters. The fur is all it has, and the fur is everything. That fur was worth a fortune in the markets of China. A single fine pelt could be traded for more than a working man earned in a year. And once the world learned this, the otter's gentleness became a death sentence. In 1741, a Russian expedition led by the Danish navigator Vitus Bering reached the Alaskan coast. The voyage was a disaster. Bering himself died of scurvy on the way home, on a barren island that now carries his name, and his ship broke apart on the rocks. But the few survivors who made it back to Siberia carried something with them: bundles of sea otter pelts. That cargo started everything. The men who came after were not explorers, they were hunters. The Russians called them promyshleniki, fur men, and they crossed from Siberia in small boats, chasing the otter east along a chain of islands that runs more than 1,000 miles into the Pacific. They could not catch the animals themselves. The otter was too fast, too well suited to the water. So they forced the people who could. The Onondagas had lived along the Aleutian Islands for thousands of years. They were among the finest sea hunters the world has produced, slipping across open ocean in skin boats so light a man could carry one on his back, hunting whales and seals in water that would kill an unprotected person in minutes. The Russians took their women and their children hostage. While the men were sent out to hunt, the families were held against their return. If a hunter came back without enough furs, the hostages were killed. On the island of Attu, 15 women and children were executed to make the lesson clear to everyone watching. Within 2 generations, disease and forced labor cut the Onondagas population to a fraction of what it had been. In 1784, a fur merchant named Grigory Shelikov sailed to Kodiak Island to build the first permanent Russian settlement in Alaska. The Sugpiaq people who lived there resisted him, so Shelikov cornered hundreds of them on a rocky islet and opened fire with cannon. They called the place Refuge Rock. The killing went on until the resistance was broken, and the survivors were enslaved and sent out to hunt the otter like the others. Shelikov went home to Russia a celebrated man and founded the company that would rule Alaska for the next 60 years. None of this appears in the story of the bargain. None of it is part of the 2 cents an acre. The man who came to run the colony was Alexander Baranov. He built his capital at Sitka, deep in the territory of the Tlingit, a powerful nation that had no intention of giving up its coast. Baranov ran Russian America for almost 30 years, building shipyards and a cathedral and a mansion on a hill, presiding over a colony that was always hungry, always short of supplies, always thousands of miles from home. In 1802, the Tlingit destroyed the Russian outpost at Sitka and drove the survivors into the sea. 2 years later, Baranov returned with warships and cannon. The Tlingit held their wooden fort for days under bombardment before slipping away into the forest at night, taking their wounded with them. The Russians called it a victory. The Tlingit called it a different thing entirely, and they are still there to call it anything at all. But the otters were not. 3 generations of relentless hunting had nearly wiped them from the Alaskan coast. The animal that had drawn an empire across an ocean was almost gone, and with it, the only reason Russia had ever come.
When the otters failed,
The Russians turned to the fur seals of the Pribilof Islands, far out in the Bering Sea. They marched whole Unangaks communities onto those islands to do the killing. Hundreds of thousands of seals clubbed on the rookeries where they bred. The people brought there to do it were not free to leave. The slaughter was so complete that the herds, like the otters, would take a century to begin to recover. By the 1860s, the math no longer worked. Russia was far from home and deep in debt after a brutal war in the Crimea. It could not feed the colony reliably, and it could not defend this coast against the British Navy if it came to that. The Russians had begun to suspect they might simply lose Alaska in a future war and be paid nothing at all. Better, they decided, to sell it to the Americans while they still could. 2 cents an acre was not the price of a treasure, it was the price of a problem someone wanted off their hands. On the 18th of October, 1867, on a hill above Sitka, the Russian flag came down and the American flag went up. As the story is told, the Russian flag snagged on the pole partway down, as if the empire itself were reluctant to let go. The land changed owners. The people who had been hunted across it for 100 years were simply handed to a new government without being asked. Again. The Russians left almost as quickly as they had come. But they left something behind that has outlasted their empire. In Sitka, the onion domes of a Russian Orthodox cathedral still rise above the harbor. And in villages all along the coast, the Orthodox faith took root and stayed. So that today, descendants of the very people the Russians enslaved still cross themselves before icons in a church their ancestors made their own. Even conquest leaves seeds. Some of them grow into something the conquerors never intended. What that government in Washington had just acquired was a country that did not yet know it was a country. And the first thing to understand about it is that the picture in everyone's head was wrong. They imagined nothing but ice. Much of Alaska's southern coast is rainforest. Along the Inside Passage, where the mainland shatters into 1,000 forested islands, lies the largest temperate rainforest left in the United States. The Tongass. Trees that were already ancient when the treaty was signed, standing in moss so deep it swallows sound, fed by more than 100 inches of rain a year. Bald eagles gather here in numbers found nowhere else, hundreds of them lining a single river when the salmon run, so common that they lose the majesty distance lends them and become simply the birds in the trees. This was the country of the Tlingit and the Haida, master carvers and seafarers who raised totem poles taller than the houses beneath them. The poles were never idols, as the missionaries assumed. They were records, genealogies, histories, the story of who a family was, carved into cedar and read like a page. When the old ways were pressured out, many of the poles were cut down or left to rot where they stood. But the carving never fully stopped. In workshops along this same coast, a new generation learned the old forms again from the few elders who still held them, and raised new poles in the old places. The forest the icebox was never supposed to contain is still standing, and beneath it, a culture two empires tried to erase is still telling its stories in wood. Move inland from the coast, and the scale of the place begins to defeat the imagination. Alaska is so large that if you laid it over the rest of the United States, it would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. 1/5 the size of everything else America owned, bought in a single morning. Its coastline alone is longer than the coastlines of all the other states combined. It is a place where a single national park can be larger than a country. Wrangell St. Elias in the southeast is bigger than Switzerland, and almost no one lives in it. The capital, Juneau, cannot be reached by road at all. To this day, the only way in or out is by sea or by air. At the heart of it all stands a mountain the Athabascan people named long before any treaty was signed. They called it Denali, the High One. It rises more than 20,000 feet, the tallest peak on the continent, but the number undersells it. Measured from its own base, the climb to its summit is greater than the climb up Everest from base camp, because Denali begins almost at sea level and goes straight up. It is so massive that it makes its own weather, pulling storms out of the sky and vanishing behind them for weeks at a time. For a century, mapmakers in Washington called it by the name of a president who never saw it. The old name waited. In time, it was given back. The mountain had outlasted the argument, the way it outlasts everything. Around its flanks move grizzly bears, gray wolves, and Dall sheep that walk ledges no predator can follow. The first men to reach its true summit climbed it in 1913, 4 of them, on a journey of many weeks through country with no trails and no rescue, hauling their own food up the glaciers. More than a century later, climbers still come from all over the world to test themselves against it. Every year, the mountain turns some of them back and keeps a few. The High One does not care who arrives at its base. The weather it makes decides who reaches the top. But the mountains are only one way this land refuses to be small. All around them, it does something it does almost nowhere else on Earth. It freezes, and the freeze becomes the landscape itself. Alaska holds more than 100,000 glaciers, rivers of ice that move so slowly you cannot see them move, grinding mountains into gravel, carving valleys wide enough to lose a city in. Where they reach the sea, they break apart in slabs the size of buildings, and the sound of the ice carving carries for miles across the water like distant thunder. When the naturalist John Muir first traveled into Glacier Bay in 1879, he found a wall of ice filling the whole inlet. Today, that ice has pulled back more than 60 miles. A bay that was solid glacier within living memory is now open water, dotted with seals. The retreat that took John Muir's whole imagination to picture has happened, and it is still happening. These rivers of ice look like the deadest places on the planet. Nothing should live inside frozen water, and yet something does. On a handful of these glaciers lives a creature no larger than a thread, the glacier iceworm. It spends its entire life inside the ice, feeding on algae that grow on the surface in the long summer dusk. It is the only animal of its kind known to live this way, sealed within a glacier from birth to death. There are glaciers in Alaska that hold millions of them. It is so adapted to the cold that warmth will kill it. Lift one into your hand, and the heat of your own skin is enough to begin dissolving it. A few degrees above freezing, and it simply comes apart. The ice that should be its grave is the only place it can survive. There are nights in summer when the surface of a glacier seems to darken and shift, and it is not a trick of the light. It is the worms, rising in their millions to feed in the cool of the evening, then sinking back down into the ice before the sun can find them in the morning. They have done this for longer than anyone can say, but the ice they depend on is leaving. The glaciers of Alaska are thinning and pulling back faster every decade, and a creature that cannot survive a warm afternoon has nowhere left to go when the cold itself retreats. Not all of Alaska's wealth is locked in stone or sealed in ice. Some of it returns every single year, swimming upstream. 5 species of Pacific salmon hatch in Alaska's rivers: the king, the sockeye, the coho, the pink, and the chum. They travel out into the open ocean, sometimes for years, and then they come back. They return to the exact stream where they were born, navigating thousands of miles of open seawater to find a few yards of gravel they last saw as eggs. They are thought to read the chemistry of the water and the pull of the Earth's own magnetic field. No one fully understands how they do it. In Bristol Bay, on the southwest coast, tens of millions of sockeye return in a single summer, the largest run of wild salmon left anywhere on Earth. On the Yukon River, the kings swim almost 2,000 miles upstream, all the way to the Canadian border, without eating a single meal along the way, living on the fat stored in their own bodies. When they arrive, they bring the ocean with them. At a place called Brooks Falls, the brown bears gather where the water steps up over a ledge, and they stand in the current with their mouths open, catching salmon out of the air as the fish leap. A bear must eat enough in these few weeks to survive the whole winter asleep, and so it eats almost nothing but salmon for as long as the run lasts. What the bears and the eagles leave behind feeds the forest itself, carrying the nutrients of the sea up into the roots of trees standing miles from any coast. Long before the Russians, long before the gold, the people of this land had built their whole lives around that return. The salmon was wealth that did not have to be dug up or shot. It simply came back. And it has kept coming back through every empire that has ever tried to claim the rivers it swims in. And the land that feeds them is not finished moving. Alaska sits on the great ring of fire that circles the Pacific, and the Aleutian chain is a line of volcanoes, more than 50 of them still active, strung across the sea like stepping stones. In 1912, on the Alaska Peninsula, one of them erupted with a force the world has not matched since. A volcano called Nova Rupta tore open and emptied a magma chamber in 3 days, throwing out more than 10 times the material of the eruption that buried Pompeii. It was the largest eruption anywhere on Earth in the entire 20th century. Ash fell so thickly on a town 100 miles away that people could not see a lantern held at arm's length, and the sky stayed dark for days. Almost no one outside Alaska has ever heard of it. It happened in a place so empty that no one was killed, in a territory the rest of the country was still calling a frozen waste. The most powerful eruption of the century went off in America's own backyard, and America barely noticed. But it was not the volcanoes, and it was not the salmon that finally changed the world's mind about Seward's Folly. It was a metal in a creek a long way north. In 1896, gold was discovered in the Klondike, just across the border in Canada's Yukon. The fastest way to reach it ran straight through Alaska, up the Inside Passage to a muddy boom town called Skagway, and then over the mountains on foot. The route was a wall of rock called the Chilkoot Pass. To stop people from starving in the wilderness beyond it, the authorities made a rule. No one could cross unless they carried a full year of supplies. A ton of goods, roughly 1,000 pounds of food and gear for every single person.
There were no horses for most of them,
And the few who tried the other route, the White Pass, killed so many pack animals in the mud that it earned the name Dead Horse Trail. So the rest carried it themselves in loads of 50 or 60 pounds at a time, climbing the staircase of ice cut into the pass, dropping the load at the top and walking back down for the next one. It could take a single person 40 trips. Some climbed that pass for 3 months without rest, just to move their own supplies to the other side. Skagway itself became a town with no law at all. A con man named Soapy Smith ran it like a private kingdom, fleecing the stampeders as fast as they arrived, until the townspeople finally turned on him and he died in a gunfight on the docks. Out of perhaps 100,000 people who set out for the goldfields, only around 30,000 ever arrived. Of those, a few thousand found any gold at all, and a tiny handful grew rich. But the stampede did something the gold itself could not. It poured tens of thousands of people into Alaska, and it forced the country that owned it to finally look at the map again, this time without laughing. Down on the windswept beaches of Nome, a few years later, men found gold lying loose in the sand itself, sorted by the surf, and the rush began all over again. Inland, a trader's lucky strike on a muddy creek grew into the town of Fairbanks, which is still there, in the heart of the interior, long after the gold gave out. The icebox, it turned out, was full of things people would cross the world to reach. But the towns the gold left behind were tied to the rest of the world by almost nothing. And in the winter of 1925, that isolation nearly killed one of them outright. A deadly sickness broke out in Nome, on the frozen edge of the Bering Sea, and the only medicine that could stop it sat hundreds of miles away in the interior. No aircraft could fly in that cold and dark, so they ran it in by dog sled. A relay of mushers and their teams carried a single small package of serum across more than 600 miles of blizzard, handing it from one team to the next through cold that froze a man's breath to his face. They covered the distance in 5.5 days. The lead dogs of the final stretch became famous around the world. A town was saved by animals running through a storm, and that run is honored still, every year, by the longest sled dog race on Earth. And then, half a century later, the world came to Alaska for a reason that had nothing to do with gold at all. It came for the position on the map. An American general named Billy Mitchell once told Congress that whoever held Alaska would hold the world. He called it the most important strategic place on the planet, the spot where the continents nearly touch, where you could reach almost anywhere across the top of the globe. Most people thought he was exaggerating. In the summer of 1942, they stopped thinking that. On the 3rd of June, Japanese carriers launched their planes against the American base at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands, raining bombs on the harbor for 2 days. It was the first foreign attack on Alaskan soil. Then, it is the 7th of June, 1942. Japanese troops come ashore on the islands of Attu and Kiska at the far western end of the chain. They take both islands almost without a fight. For the first time since the War of 1812, a foreign army holds ground on North American soil. The land they take is American only because of the 2 cents an acre paid 75 years before. On Attu, the soldiers find a small Unangax village. The people there have lived on that island for thousands of years. The Japanese ship them across the ocean to a prison camp in northern Japan, where almost half of them will die of hunger and disease, far from any sea they recognize. And then the United States does something to the rest of the Unangax that is harder to explain. Across the other Aleutian Islands, the American government removes its own citizens from their homes. It tells them it is for their protection. It puts them in abandoned canneries and rotting camps in southeastern Alaska with little food and less medicine. People die there too, the old and the very young, of sickness that did not have to kill anyone. And when the war is finally over, many of them are not allowed to go home at all. Their villages have been looted or burned, sometimes by the very soldiers meant to be defending them, and they are simply told there is nothing left to return to. They had survived the Russians. They had survived 100 years of being hunted across their own ocean. They were very nearly broken by the country that had bought them. The battle to take the islands back came in May of 1943. American soldiers landed on Attu, expecting a few days of fighting. They got more than 2 weeks of it, in freezing fog, on terrain so brutal that the cold and the wet put more men in the hospital than enemy fire did. Soldiers froze in their foxholes, their boots rotted off their feet. At the end, the Japanese commander, Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, gathered the last of his men in the dark. Before dawn on the 29th of May, they charged straight into the American lines in a final attack, knowing it could not succeed, screaming as they came. The fighting was hand-to-hand. Almost none of them survived. When it was over, nearly 3,000 men lay dead on a frozen island most Americans could not have found on a map. It was the only land battle of the entire Second World War fought on American soil, and it has very nearly slipped out of memory altogether. The war that almost no one remembers, on the islands almost no one can name. The general who said, "Whoever held Alaska held the world," had been right. It had only taken a war on its outermost edge to prove it. The war changed the territory in another way that outlasted the fighting. To move men and supplies north in a hurry, the army drove a road through more than 1,000 miles of forest and muskeg, from Canada all the way into the interior, and they built it in a single, frantic summer. For the first time in its history, the land bought for 2 cents an acre was joined to the rest of the continent by something other than the sea. The road is still there. Much of Alaska still is not on it. When the war ended, Alaska did not go back to sleep. The Cold War had begun, and across the narrow water of the Bering Strait stood the Soviet Union. At the strait's center lie 2 small islands, the Diomedes, barely 2.5 miles apart. One belongs to Russia, one belongs to the United States. Between them runs the line where one day ends and the next begins. From the American island on a clear morning, you can look across the water and see tomorrow. Alaska had become the front line. A chain of radar stations was strung across the top of the continent to watch for missiles coming over the pole, listening into the dark for the first minutes of a war that everyone feared and no one wanted. The frozen territory bought for 2 cents an acre was now the country's first warning against the end of the world. In 1959, Alaska finally became the 49th state, by far the largest in the Union and one of the most strategically important places the country owned. The land itself is not gentle, even when no one is fighting over it. It sits on the seam where two great plates of the earth grind past one another, and every so often, that seam slips. On Good Friday, the 27th of March, 1964, at 36 minutes past 5 in the evening, the ground beneath Prince William Sound moves. It is the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North America, and the second most powerful ever recorded anywhere on Earth. A magnitude of 9.2. It does not stop after a few seconds the way most earthquakes do. It goes on for more than 4 minutes, long enough for people to run outside, fall down, get up, and run again. Whole neighborhoods of Anchorage slide downhill on a layer of clay that turns to liquid under the shaking. In the town of Valdez, the waterfront simply drops into the sea, taking the men working the docks with it. The waves came next. Landslides under the water threw up walls of sea more than 200 feet high inside the narrow inlets. The shaking reached so far that boats were torn loose from their moorings in Louisiana, and the tsunami killed people as far south as the coast of California. By the time the sea settled, more than 130 people were dead, and entire towns had to be abandoned and rebuilt on safer ground. Valdez was moved, building by building, 4 miles down the shore to firmer land. But the quake left something behind besides ruin. In 1964, scientists were still arguing over a strange new idea, that the continents themselves drift, riding on enormous plates that move and collide. A geologist named George Plafka went to Alaska to study the wreckage, and by measuring exactly how the land had risen in some places and sunk in others, across thousands of square miles, he found the proof. One vast slab of the Earth's crust had slid beneath another. The disaster that leveled Anchorage helped confirm how the entire surface of the planet behaves. Push further north, past the mountains, and the trees themselves give up. The land flattens into tundra that runs all the way to the Arctic Ocean, frozen solid for most of the year, soft and green and crowded with life for a few short weeks of summer. At the very top of the continent sits the community of Utqiagvik, the northernmost town in the United States, where the Inupiat people still hunt the bowhead whale from open-skin boats, the way their ancestors did. A single whale can feed a village for a winter, and the catch is shared across the whole community, as it always has been. Here the sun does not set for nearly 3 months in summer. In the depth of winter, it does not rise for 2. But in that long winter dark, the sky does not stay empty. The aurora unrolls across it in slow curtains of green and violet, charged particles thrown off by the sun, caught and bent by the Earth's magnetic field, and set glowing far overhead. For the people of the North, it has never been a curiosity to be explained. It is a presence. It was woven into their stories long before any instrument could measure what it was. The bowhead they hunt may be the longest-lived mammal on Earth. Old harpoon points, carved from stone and ivory, have been cut from living whales. Weapons fired into them more than a century before. Some of these animals were already swimming under the ice when Seward signed his treaty. Across this same tundra moves one of the last great migrations left on the planet. The porcupine caribou herd, well over 100,000 animals, travels hundreds of miles each year between its winter range and a single stretch of coastal plain where the calves are born. They have walked these routes for thousands of years, following the same ground, drawn north every spring to the one place flat and safe enough to give birth, where the wind off the sea keeps the worst of the insects away. The Gwich'in people have followed them just as long. Their entire way of life is bound to the rhythm of an animal that never stops moving, and they call that carving ground the sacred place where life begins. They are not alone out there. Along the same Arctic coast, polar bears come ashore to dig dens into the snow, where the females give birth in the deep of winter and nurse their cubs in the dark until spring. They are the largest land predators on Earth, and they live at the exact edge of where life is possible, on the line between the ice and the open water that is itself beginning to shift beneath them. But that carving ground sits on top of something the rest of the world wants very badly, and that is the part of the story where the 2 cents an acre finally comes due. In 1968, on the frozen North Slope, a drilling crew struck oil. Not a modest find, the largest oil field ever discovered in North America, holding billions of barrels beneath the permafrost. So much oil that for years it would supply nearly a fifth of all the crude produced in the United States. This was the answer to the question the country had been mocking for 100 years. This was what the icebox held. The land that had been called worthless was sitting on a fortune so large it would remake the entire state and rearrange the politics of American energy along with it. But there was a problem: the size of the territory itself. The oil was at the very top of the world, frozen in place for most of the year, and the nearest port that did not freeze over in winter was 800 miles away, across 3 mountain ranges, hundreds of rivers, and a wilderness with almost no roads at all. So they built a pipeline, 4 feet across, 800 miles long, running from the Arctic coast all the way down to the ice-free port of Valdez, the same Valdez the earthquake had destroyed only a decade before. Because the hot oil would melt the frozen ground it crossed, nearly half the pipeline could not be buried at all. It had to be lifted onto stilts, snaking above the tundra, fitted with heat pipes that draw the warmth up and out of the supports so the permafrost beneath them stays frozen. And it was built to zigzag rather than run straight, so that when the earth shakes, and in Alaska, the earth always shakes, the pipeline would slide and flex with it, instead of snapping in two. It was one of the largest construction projects ever attempted by private hands. Tens of thousands of workers came from everywhere, living in camps strung along the route, working through winters so cold that steel grew brittle, and the machinery had to be kept running day and night so it would not seize up. They laid it across the wilderness in 3 years, and when it was finished, the oil began to flow, 2 million barrels of it a day at its peak. The money that came with it was so vast that the state did something almost no other place on Earth has done. It set aside a share of the oil wealth in a permanent fund, and every year since, it has paid a portion of that fund directly to every man, woman, and child who lives in Alaska. The land Seward was ridiculed for buying now writes a check to its own people, once a year, simply for being there. The oil did more than write checks. It built the modern state almost from nothing, paving roads the gold towns never had, raising schools and clinics in villages that had gone without, funding a government that for most of its history had been an afterthought run from somewhere far away. For a few decades, the frozen wasteland of the old headlines became one of the wealthiest corners of the country, measured by what each person had. The Folly had become the opposite of a folly so completely that it grew easy to forget anyone had ever laughed. And then, just after midnight, on a clear night in March of 1989, a tanker loaded with that same North Slope oil ran aground just outside Valdez. It tore its hull open on a charted reef, and 11 million gallons of crude poured out into Prince William Sound. The oil spread across more than 1,000 miles of coastline. It coated the sea otters that had only just begun to recover from the fur trade a century before, gluing their fur shut so they could no longer stay warm, and they died in the thousands. It killed seabirds by the hundreds of thousands. The same waters the salmon returned to, the same sound the earthquake had heaved 25 years earlier, ran black from shore to shore. Some of that oil is still there today, buried just under the surface of beaches that look clean from a passing boat. This was the full price of the bargain, laid out at last. The richest fishery on Earth and the largest oil field on the continent in the same place, depending on the same untouched coast, and not enough room for both to be safe. Seward had been right. The 2 cents an acre was repaid 1,000 times over, in gold, in oil, in salmon, in the position on the map that helped win one war and stand watch through another. As a piece of business, it may be the single greatest land deal in the history of the United States.
But a place is not only a piece of business.
And the longer you look at Alaska, the harder it becomes to add up the ledger and call it finished. The sea otter has come back. From a few hundred survivors scattered in hidden coves, the population has climbed into the tens of thousands, rafting again in the kelp along the southern coast, doing the slow work of healing a sea that has been taken from twice over. It is the closest thing to a happy ending the story offers, and it took more than 100 years to arrive. The Unangacs are still here. So are the Tlingit, the Sugpiaq, the Inupiat, the Athabascan, the Gwich'in, the Yupik. The people who were never asked, who were handed from one empire to another for 2 cents an acre, never agreed to disappear. They are still hunting the whale, still catching the salmon, still speaking languages the Russians and then the Americans tried to erase, still living on the islands their ancestors crossed open ocean to reach. After the war, the descendants of the interned Unangacs pressed the government for decades and were finally owed an apology and a measure of repair for what had been done to them. It was not justice, but it was an admission, in writing, that there had been something to answer for. That is the part of the bargain that was never anyone's to sell. The land could change owners on a piece of paper in a room in Washington before dawn. The people could not. And the land is changing again now, faster than any treaty ever could. Alaska is warming more than twice as quickly as the rest of the country. The permafrost the pipeline was engineered to stand on is beginning to thaw. The glaciers John Muir walked across are pulling back, taking the ice worm's entire world with them. The sea ice the Inupiat hunt from is growing thin and treacherous, breaking up earlier each spring. Whole villages on the eroding coast are being forced to pick up and move inland, among the first communities in America driven from their homes by a changing climate. Seward bought a frozen country for 2 cents an acre, certain that one day it would be understood. He was right about its worth and wrong about almost everything else. He could not have imagined the gold, or the oil, or the war fought on its edge, or the line in the sea where you can stand and look across at tomorrow. And he could not have imagined that the ice he was ridiculed for buying would one day begin to melt out from under the very wealth that proved him right. So the question the Folly story never asks is still open. Not whether the purchase was clever, that was answered a long time ago, but what it cost. and who paid, and whether the wealth pulled out of this land was ever worth the price the land is only now beginning to name. The otters are back in the kelp. The salmon are still climbing the rivers, 2,000 miles upstream, on the strength they carry in their own bodies. The caribou are still walking north to the place where life begins. And somewhere on a thinning glacier, in the cool blue dark of a summer night, a creature the size of a thread is quietly running out of the cold it needs to live. 2 cents an acre. It was the price of the land. It was never the price of everything the land would ask in return. Thank you for traveling with us to the top of the world. Until the next journey, take a breath and stay a while.